In the unforgiving dust of the American Southwest, where the only law that mattered was written in lead and fire, there emerged a name that carved fear into the bones of every man who dared cross him: Curly Bill Brocius. The Old West wasn't a place for the timid. It was a world fueled by whiskey, pride, and the iron of a well-worn Colt revolver. In this brutal and unrelenting terrain, men didn't live by morality. They lived by how fast they could draw and how steady they could aim. And Curly Bill? He didn't just survive in this world, he ruled it. To understand the rise of Curly Bill is to step into a time when towns appeared overnight, drawn by silver veins buried in the earth, and were just as quickly swallowed by gunfire and greed. Lawmen were few. Justice was slower than a wounded horse. And outlaws, they were everywhere. But among the sea of bandits and desperados, Curly Bill Brocius stood apart. Not because he was the fastest or the most cunning, but because he embodied something deeper, the chaotic soul of the Wild West. Every legend has a beginning, but with Curly Bill even his origins are wrapped in dust and mystery. Some say he came from Texas, others swear it was Missouri. But wherever he rode from, one thing is certain. When he arrived in Arizona around 1878, he brought more than just a herd of cattle. He brought trouble. Curly Bill didn't blend in. He wasn't a quiet rancher or a drifting cowboy. No, he was the kind of man who walked into a saloon and made the air tense before he even reached the bar. He was loud, unpredictable, dangerous, and he liked it that way. He quickly made his way to Tombstone, a town that would later become infamous for one of the most iconic gunfights in Western history. But long before the OK Corral became a name burned into textbooks and movies, Tombstone was just another boomtown filled with gamblers, gunslingers, and fortune seekers. And it was there that Curly Bill built his empire, not with laws, but with bullets. He didn't work alone. As leader of the loosely organized but deadly Clanton gang, Curly Bill became the center of a group of cowboys who operated on the fringes of society, robbing, rustling, and murdering their way into infamy. He was no mere thug. Curly Bill was charismatic in his own twisted way. He could rally men to his side with promises of power and profit, yet turn on a friend without hesitation if crossed. His love for liquor and chaos made him unpredictable. And unpredictability was lethal in the West. Many feared him not just because of what he'd done, but because no one could guess what he'd do next. He was a man ruled by impulse, and that made him one of the most terrifying figures on the frontier. But even among killers and outlaws, Curly Bill's name carried a different weight. He wasn't the type to hide behind others or let his men do the dirty work. He was often the first to draw, the first to shout, the first to fire. He didn't care if you were a sheriff, a rival, or a random drunk who looked at him wrong. If Curly Bill thought you were a threat, you were already a dead man walking. As stories of his brutality spread, of cattle driven off under the moonlight, of drunken shootouts in dusty streets, of men who vanished after crossing him, so too did his legend. To some, he was a hero of rebellion, a man who refused to be tamed. To others, he was a devil with a revolver. But love him or hate him, everyone agreed on one thing. Curly Bill Brocius was a force of nature. And this was just the beginning. Before the gunfire, before the blood-soaked streets of Tombstone, and long before he became a name that echoed through saloons like a curse, William Brocius, better known as Curly Bill, was a ghost. His early life is a riddle wrapped in dust, obscured by time and tangled legends. Some say he was born in Texas, others claim Missouri. No birth certificate, no childhood letters, no family names written in the pages of official record books. It's as if the land itself gave birth to him, a child of chaos and violence shaped by the untamed frontier. What we do know is this. Around 1878, a man with unruly curls, a crooked smile, and a volatile temper crossed into the Arizona territory with a herd of cattle and a 1,000-yard stare. He was in his early 30s, already hardened by years few could account for. He told some that he intended to sell the cattle to the San Carlos Indian Reservation, which he did. But Curly Bill wasn't the type to settle into ranch life and raise a family. That wasn't in his blood. He had tasted the lawless freedom of the borderlands, and he was thirsty for more. After unloading his cattle, Brocius drifted south toward Tombstone, a mining boomtown rising fast on the promise of silver and sin. It was a place where fortunes were made overnight and lives ended just as quickly. The town was teeming with opportunists, outlaws, gamblers, prospectors, and drifters from every corner of the country. It was a powder keg of ambition, greed, and desperation. For Curly Bill, it was perfect. Tombstone welcomed him with open arms and a loaded gun. He quickly made a name for himself, not for his business savvy or charm, but for his brutality. He was known to shoot livestock just for the thrill. Ranchers whispered his name with a mix of fear and loathing. Saloon doors swung wide at his approach, not out of respect, but out of pure survival. Everyone knew Curly Bill didn't need a reason to pull the trigger, just a twitch, a look, a word spoken out of place. But Curly Bill was more than a drunk with a gun. He was intelligent, calculated when he needed to be, and dangerously persuasive. He began to attract men to his side, killers, rustlers, fugitives. Among them were Ike and Billy Clanton, Johnny Ringo, and other dangerous figures who would come to be known as the Cowboys. They weren't an organized gang in the traditional sense, but more of a brotherhood of outlaws united by a common bond: contempt for the law and a hunger for chaos. The Cowboys controlled smuggling routes, ran stolen cattle through the Mexican border, and corrupted local officials with bribes or bullets. They operated like a shadow government in the Arizona territory, untouchable and feared. And Curly Bill was the center of it all, a magnetic force of lawlessness whose reputation kept growing with every body that hit the dirt. His laugh was said to echo in the ears of those he shot, his drunken howls filling the night before a storm of violence. But he wasn't reckless without purpose. Tombstone was full of shifting power, and Curly Bill knew how to read it. He played his cards carefully, keeping allies close and enemies guessing. Even in the midst of lawless mayhem, Brocius understood politics better than most politicians. Still, the truth about his past remained elusive. Some speculated he had killed a man in Texas and fled west. Others believed he had served in the Confederate Army under an alias. One thing was certain: Curly Bill didn't care what you believed as long as you stayed out of his way. He wasn't interested in legacy or redemption. He lived for the moment, the rush, the thrill of standing on the edge with death waiting on the other side. And as he settled into his new life in Tombstone, with blood on his hands and silver in his pocket, Curly Bill Brocius had only just begun to etch his name into the pages of Western infamy. When Curly Bill Brocius planted his boots into the dust-choked streets of Tombstone, the town was already teetering on the edge of legend. Silver had turned the Arizona territory into a magnet for misfits, dreamers, and killers, and Tombstone was their twisted cathedral. Gambling halls clinked with coin, brothels overflowed with whiskey-laced laughter, and gunfire echoed like a twisted symphony across the high desert. It wasn't just a town. It was a loaded revolver waiting for someone to pull the trigger. And Curly Bill, he was that trigger. He didn't come quietly. Within weeks of his arrival, his name was already being whispered in every saloon, every poker table, every dark alley where men with shaky hands tried to hide their fear behind whiskey. Curly Bill Brocius wasn't just another outlaw passing through. He was something worse, someone who didn't care about law, order, or consequence. He didn't steal because he was poor. He didn't kill because he had to. He did both because he could. It wasn't long before Tombstone got its first taste of his fury. October of 1880, a night so thick with tension it could be cut with a Bowie knife. Lawmen tried to disarm Curly Bill, standard procedure in a town that had grown weary of drunks with twitchy fingers. But Bill wasn't just drunk. He was enraged, and that rage exploded when he raised his pistol and shot Tombstone's first sheriff, Fred White, dead in the street. Cold, fast, unflinching. The sheriff dropped before his badge hit the ground. Shock swept the town. For a moment it seemed even Curly Bill might pay for his sins. He was arrested, charged with murder. There was talk of justice. But the West had its own rules, and the courtroom didn't run on morality. It ran on influence, fear, and silence. The jury ruled White's death an accident. Self-defense. Curly Bill walked free, smirking at the crowd outside the courthouse like a man who knew he could never be touched. From that moment, his legend exploded. Every outlaw, rustler, and smuggler within 100 miles either wanted to join him or stay the hell out of his way. He became a symbol of the cowboy gang's growing grip on Tombstone. Alongside men like Ike Clanton, Johnny Ringo, and Pony Deal, Curly Bill turned the dusty town into a battleground. The law was no longer enforced by sheriffs. It was enforced by fear, and Bill was the high priest of that gospel. He drank hard, rode harder, and shot without hesitation. He was known to execute a man for insulting a friend, or simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He laughed loud, fired faster, and cared little for the consequences. He would walk into a saloon, pour a drink, and then shoot the bottles off the shelves just to watch them shatter. People began crossing the street to avoid him, avoiding eye contact as if looking directly at him might earn a bullet. But beneath the chaos, there was strategy. Curly Bill knew exactly what he was doing. His violence wasn't random, it was tactical. It was about power, intimidation, control. He made sure no one forgot who ran Tombstone when the sun went down. And the town? It submitted. Businesses paid protection. Politicians turned blind eyes. Sheriffs chose their battles carefully, because one wrong move could mean waking up with your name etched into a headstone before breakfast. Curly Bill didn't just take over Tombstone with a gang. He conquered it with reputation, speed, and raw fear. Every man in town knew you could call the law, you could hire a gun, you could pray to your God, but when Curly Bill Brocius came looking for you, none of that would save you. And the worst part, he was just getting warmed up. Tombstone was a town standing on a fault line. Beneath its thriving saloons, gambling dens, and dusty storefronts, there was tension, coiled, invisible, waiting to snap. And when it did, it exploded in the form of a single shot, fired under a moonlit sky by none other than Curly Bill Brocius. That bullet didn't just take a life. It ignited a war, shattered illusions, and forever marked Tombstone as a place where the line between outlaw and lawman had vanished into the gun smoke. It was late October 1880, a night like any other in a town where violence passed for routine. But something was different this time. Curly Bill had been drinking, and when he drank, the world shifted sideways. His temper became molten. His sense of consequence dissolved into nothingness. He wandered into the streets, staggering through the darkness, firing his gun wildly into the night, like a conductor leading a twisted orchestra. Bullets cracked against buildings, windows shattered. The town trembled. Sheriff Fred White, a man known for patience and restraint, stepped into the chaos. He wasn't a gunslinger. He wasn't a killer. He was a man of law who believed peace could still hold some ground in a lawless world. As he approached Curly Bill, he wasn't armed for war. He was armed with calm words and the authority of a badge. Witnesses say he asked Brocius to hand over his weapon. No threats, no force, just an attempt to de-escalate. But Curly Bill wasn't in a mood to be calmed. With glassy eyes and a smile that twisted more with madness than amusement, he pulled the trigger. Whether on purpose or by reflex, is still debated to this day. What's not debated is the result. Fred White crumpled to the ground, a fatal hole torn through him by Curly Bill's bullet. The first sheriff of Tombstone, the man who had tried to bring law to a land that spat on it, lay dying in the dirt. The silence that followed was heavy, as if the desert itself held its breath. Curly Bill was arrested almost immediately, but even in chains he laughed. He claimed it was an accident, he hadn't meant to shoot. Maybe the gun discharged while he handed it over. Maybe he was startled. Maybe. But the people of Tombstone weren't interested in excuses. They wanted justice. They wanted blood. And many of them wanted to see Brocius hang before sunrise. But the West doesn't deal in simple justice. One man stood between Brocius and a lynch mob, Wyatt Earp. At that moment, the future lawman and legend made a choice that would haunt him. He stood up for Curly Bill, defending the outlaw against a crowd ready to string him up. Earp argued that Brocius deserved a trial, due process, law, even for killers. Maybe Wyatt was protecting the idea of justice, or maybe he already understood the political tightrope Tombstone was balancing on. Either way, he escorted Brocius to court, and in court the unthinkable happened. Curly Bill was acquitted. Witnesses, perhaps afraid or bribed, offered inconsistent stories. Others said White himself had told them, before dying, that the shooting was accidental. The jury ruled in Brocius's favor. In a town that had just buried its sheriff, the man who pulled the trigger walked free. No punishment, no justice, just a smirk on Curly Bill's face and the growing fear in everyone else's. The verdict didn't just embolden Brocius, it crowned him. Now he was more than just a killer. He was untouchable. The law had failed, and Tombstone knew it. A man had murdered their peacekeeper in cold blood and walked away. What hope did any ordinary citizen have against men like Curly Bill and the Cowboys? The message was clear. In Tombstone, might made right, and Curly Bill Brocius was the mightiest of them all. After the courtroom doors swung closed and Curly Bill Brocius walked out a free man, Tombstone was never the same. The people had witnessed something terrifying, law shattered not by a bullet, but by a smile and a legal technicality. With the sheriff buried and justice buried beside him, fear gripped the town like a cold wind rolling off the desert. And Curly Bill? He thrived in it. The acquittal didn't untame him. It turned him into something more dangerous. A man who believed he could never be touched. He moved through the streets like a king without a crown, backed by shadows in wide-brimmed hats, men who drank whiskey in silence and answered only to the laws of blood and loyalty. That was the true rise of the Cowboy gang. Under Curly Bill's influence, they stopped hiding their crimes and started operating in broad daylight. They weren't just bandits anymore. They were an empire of outlaws. Curly Bill alliances were forged in smoke-filled saloons and over the graves of those who dared to resist. Among his closest companions were men like Johnny Ringo, dead-eyed and deadly, and the Clantons, Ike and Billy, always quick to start a fight and quicker to vanish when things got too hot. Then there was Pony Deal, ruthless and unpredictable, and a small army of nameless riders who rustled cattle, ran whiskey, and buried bodies in shallow desert graves. The Cowboys' operations were sprawling. They moved stolen cattle across the Mexican border, selling them to corrupt officials or fencing them through local traders. Stagecoaches were ambushed, ranchers extorted, informants silenced. If you lived in Cochise County and owned a horse, a herd, or a heartbeat, you lived under the Cowboys' shadow. But their true power didn't just lie in numbers or firepower, it came from influence. Local lawmen, judges, even politicians learned quickly that cooperation was safer than defiance. Silver changed hands. Witnesses disappeared. Arrests were rare and convictions rarer still. Tombstone wasn't under siege by criminals. It was ruled by them. And Curly Bill was the dark heart of it all. In saloons, he was unpredictable. One night, he might buy drinks for the house, telling jokes and laughing like a man without a care in the world. The next, he might turn on a friend for a misplaced word and leave him bleeding on the floor. His moods shifted with the desert wind. Calm one moment, explosive the next. He once forced a man to dance at gunpoint in the middle of the street, laughing as bullets tore the dust around his feet. No one knew where the line was with Brocius, only that once it was crossed you didn't live long enough to apologize. Yet strangely, he wasn't entirely hated. Some admired him, feared, yes, but also respected in the twisted logic of the West. In a land where lawmen could be bought and justice could be dodged, Curly Bill was honest in his own way. He didn't pretend to be good. He didn't wear a badge. He was exactly what he appeared to be, dangerous, wild, and absolutely free. But freedom in that world came with a cost. The violence escalated, more robberies, more murders, more lines crossed. The Cowboys became bolder, taunting the Earps, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, who had stepped into the vacuum left by Sheriff White's death. Tensions grew like storm clouds. Eyes narrowed in saloons, hands hovered near holsters. Everyone in Tombstone felt it. Something was coming, something terrible. A showdown not born from hatred, but from the impossibility of two forces trying to coexist in a town too small for both. And at the center of that gathering storm, laughing through his whiskey, polishing his gun, stood Curly Bill Brocius. It was March 1881, and the desert heat hadn't yet swallowed the territory whole, but inside the saloons of Maxie near Camp Thomas, tempers were already boiling. The whiskey poured freely, the cards slapped hard against the tables, and in the shadows, killers and legends drank side by side. Among them, as always, was Curly Bill Brocius, now more than an outlaw, more than a man. He was the storm that came without warning. But this time, the blood that spilled wouldn't come from a planned ambush or an outlaw's revenge. It would come from within his own ranks. Dick Lloyd wasn't a man unfamiliar with chaos. A cowboy through and through, he was used to the hard living, the rough talk, the quick draw. But he wasn't Curly Bill. He didn't have the instinct for survival masked behind a smile. And on that fateful night, his recklessness would mark his end. Lloyd stumbled into the saloon where Curly Bill and his companions were drinking heavily. He was already drunk, wild-eyed, waving his pistol like a toy, ranting about something no one remembered. Then he fired. A bullet tore through the air, striking a man and dropping him to the floor in a scream of agony. It was senseless, it was sloppy, and it interrupted Curly Bill's whiskey. The room fell into silence. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Curly Bill stood, calm but furious, and looked Lloyd in the eyes. No warning, no words, just the understanding that something irreversible had happened. Brocius had spent years building his empire, intimidation, respect, and ruthless control. And here was a man tearing it all down with a single drunk shot. 12 men stood with Curly Bill that night. 12 outlaws, killers, survivors of ambushes and lynch mobs. And in that moment, they all knew what had to be done. Without ceremony, without mercy, they drew their guns and unleashed hell. The saloon filled with smoke, lead, and screams. Dick Lloyd didn't stand a chance. His body was torn apart by bullets, each one a message. Discipline matters, loyalty matters, and above all, Curly Bill's authority was never to be challenged, not even by his own. When the smoke cleared, Lloyd lay dead. Blood pooled on the wooden floor, chairs overturned, lamps flickering. Curly Bill calmly sat back down and poured himself another drink. It wasn't rage, it wasn't pleasure, it was necessity. He'd maintained control, sent a message. Later, the saloon owner, a man named O'Neill, claimed responsibility, pled guilty to the murder. It was a move that confused many, but in the West, guilt was often bartered, passed around like poker chips at the table of survival. O'Neill walked away free, no charges stuck, and Curly Bill, untouched again. Witnesses, none brave enough to speak. And so the incident faded into whispers, another story for the backrooms and the outposts. But the lesson remained carved into the minds of every man in Curly Bill's circle. Loyalty wasn't just expected, it was enforced by bullets. That night deepened the myth of Curly Bill. He wasn't just feared by sheriffs or lawmen now, he was feared by his own. A man who wouldn't hesitate to turn his gun on friend or foe if the order of things was threatened. It also revealed something darker. Brocius wasn't chaotic, not really. Every move, every outburst, every execution was calculated. Dick Lloyd had made the mistake of bringing recklessness into a world where control was everything. He had embarrassed Curly Bill in front of his gang, and for that he paid the ultimate price. And Tombstone, it didn't blink. Because in a town ruled by ghosts, gunfire was just another note in the soundtrack of survival. It was a night soaked in whiskey and gunpowder, like so many others that Curly Bill Brocius had survived. But this time, the bullets didn't just echo into the desert. They changed everything. May 25, 1881, in Galeyville, Arizona. The saloon roared with laughter and liquor, but beneath the surface, tension brewed like a thunderstorm over the mountains. Curly Bill, already infamous, was surrounded by his loyal cowboys. And across the bar stood a man named Jim Wallace, another outlaw, another veteran of violence, but not one willing to be humiliated. Wallace had made a critical mistake. He insulted Billy Breckenridge, a vice-marshal of Tombstone, but more importantly, a friend and ally to Brocius. Breckenridge, trying to keep peace, brushed it off. But Curly Bill wasn't built for tolerance. He demanded an apology, loudly, publicly, and with his hand dangerously close to his holster. Wallace, seeing the storm in Brocius's eyes, relented and offered a shaky apology, but it wasn't enough. Not for Curly Bill. The saloon air thickened. Silence spread through the room like wildfire, everyone bracing for the eruption. Then Curly Bill, still drunk and brimming with fury, muttered a final insult. "Damn son of a..." from Lincoln County. It was more than an insult. It was a declaration of war, a reminder of bloody history and unfinished vendettas from the Lincoln County War. Wallace's eyes narrowed. He turned and walked out of the saloon. But he wasn't running. He was baiting the devil. Curly Bill followed, maybe out of pride, maybe out of habit, maybe because when you rule by fear, you can't afford to look weak. But Wallace wasn't bluffing. The moment Brocius stepped outside, a shot cracked through the air. The bullet struck him clean, tearing through his cheek and neck. Blood sprayed into the dust. For the first time in a long time, Curly Bill Brocius was on the receiving end of a gun. Wallace didn't run. He was arrested. But in the courtroom, justice took a rare stand. The judge ruled in favor of Wallace, declaring he had acted in self-defense. It was a statement the whole territory heard. Even Curly Bill wasn't invincible. The man who shot sheriffs, ruled saloons and crushed rebellions with a wink, now bore the mark of his own mortality. A wound not just of flesh, but of reputation. The bullet didn't kill him, but it changed him. For weeks, Brocius struggled to recover. Witnesses said he could still ride, still drink, but his swagger had dulled. His smile came slower. His face bore the scar like a crack in a monument. Some say the wound never truly healed, that he was never the same man again. Others say it drove him deeper into chaos, more desperate to prove he was still the king of the desert. And as Curly Bill tried to cling to his empire, new enemies were rising. Wyatt Earp, already watching the Cowboys closely, saw the opportunity. He knew Brocius was wounded, vulnerable, and he knew that the days of Tombstone being ruled by gangs were numbered. Wyatt wasn't just a lawman anymore. He was a hunter. And Curly Bill had just started bleeding in the water. This moment, this gunshot, this crack in the armor, it marked the beginning of the end. Not with a grand shootout or a posse chase, but with a single trigger pulled under starlight. It reminded every man watching that no legend, no matter how feared, could outrun a bullet forever. By the summer of 1881, the Arizona sun was not the only thing scorching the land. Tensions had turned Tombstone and its outskirts into a powder keg ready to explode. And at the edge of it all, hidden among the dry gulches and canyons, moved Curly Bill Brocius and the Cowboys, now bloodied, paranoid, and more dangerous than ever. After being shot in the face by Jim Wallace, Brocius didn't retreat. He evolved. He became unpredictable. The wound didn't weaken his command. It made it ruthless. That July, the Cowboys turned their eyes south across the border toward the rugged, lawless terrain of Skeleton Canyon. Deep within those sun-baked ridges, a new opportunity emerged. A caravan of Mexican smugglers moving cattle and silver, unknowingly heading into the lion's den. According to the whispers that crawled through the territory, Brocius and his men had been waiting for days, hidden among the rocks like rattlesnakes with fingers on triggers. When the ambush came, it was brutal. The Mexicans never stood a chance. 6 cowboys, faces half-covered, eyes gleaming with intent, opened fire from the cliffs. The canyon echoed with gunfire, dust, and the dying screams of men who had no idea they were walking into death. Reports say that 6 Mexican vaqueros were gunned down without mercy, and the rest were captured, tied, and interrogated. Curly Bill's crew wanted everything: cattle, coins, weapons, anything that could be sold, traded, or used to expand their shadow empire. Some historians claim it wasn't just about greed, it was retaliation. Earlier raids along the border or lingering grudges from the volatile frontier might have stoked the fire. But whatever the reason, it was one of the bloodiest ambushes the borderlands had seen, and for Curly Bill, it was just another message written in lead. No one, lawman, outlaw, or foreigner, was safe from the Cowboys. What followed was even more telling. The stolen beef, carcasses still warm, was sold to none other than Newman Haynes Clanton, the patriarch of the Clanton clan and a trusted ally of Brocius. It was a chilling arrangement. The Cowboys weren't just criminals anymore. They had a network, a system. Stolen cattle became legal property in a single transaction. Corruption wasn't just the background noise of the West, it was the melody. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done playing its hand. The very next month, in a twist of poetic justice or brutal irony, Newman Clanton, Old Man Clanton himself, and 4 of his men were ambushed and killed along the trail to Tombstone. They had been moving more stolen cattle, many believed, from the same massacre at Skeleton Canyon. Their blood soaked the same land that had made them rich. Was it Mexican revenge? Was it retribution from rival outlaws? Or was it simply the cycle of violence devouring itself? As usual, Curly Bill Brocius walked away unscathed, or so it seemed. There was no direct evidence placing him at either massacre. Some argued he was still recovering from his gunshot wound. Others insisted he orchestrated the ambushes from behind the scenes, always one step removed, always protected by silence and fear. No arrests were made, no trials held. The desert kept its secrets. But for those watching from the shadows, the writing was on the wall. The cowboys had gone too far. Skeleton Canyon wasn't just a massacre, it was a tipping point. The townsfolk, lawmen, and honest ranchers no longer whispered their fear. They shouted it. The public's appetite for justice, real justice, was growing, and men like Wyatt Earp were sharpening their resolve. Still, Curly Bill laughed in the saloons and rode through the canyons as if invincible, because for a time, he was. But every outlaw tale has a moment when the myth begins to crack. Skeleton Canyon was that moment. The blood of strangers had stained his hands before, but now the land itself seemed to recoil. The wild was turning against him, and every step he took stirred the winds of retribution. By the fall of 1881, Tombstone had become a boiling pot of ambition, vengeance, and gunpowder. Tensions between lawmen and outlaws had reached a fever pitch. The cowboys, led in part by Curly Bill Brocius, moved like shadows, unchecked and confident, while the Earp brothers patrolled the streets with the weight of authority and the threat of frontier justice. The city was on edge. Everyone felt it. Something inevitable was building. And on October 26th, it exploded. The gunfight at the OK Corral was never just a shootout. It was a reckoning. And even though Curly Bill wasn't a T among the men who faced off in that narrow lot beside C.S. Fly's photography studio, the echoes of that standoff would ripple straight into his life, like a bullet cracking through wood. The confrontation was brief, just 30 seconds of gunfire, but in those half-minute flashes of smoke and lead, 3 cowboys fell, Billy Clanton and the McClory brothers. On the other side, Wyatt Earp, Virgil Earp, and Doc Holliday stood bloodied but alive. To the law, it was a justified act of enforcement. To the cowboys, it was murder. And for Curly Bill Brocius, it was personal. The cowboys weren't just a gang. They were a brotherhood. Bloodied hands and broken laws held them together. The death of their own wasn't something to mourn quietly. It was a call to arms. What followed was no longer a battle for control. It was a war. In the weeks after the OK Corral, retribution came swiftly. On December 28th, Virgil Earp was ambushed and shot in the street, his arm shattered by a shotgun blast. A few months later, on March 18th, Morgan Earp was assassinated while playing billiards, a single bullet severing his spine. He died before his brother's eyes. These weren't random acts of violence. They were coordinated strikes meant to cripple the Earps, to break their will. The territory burned with suspicion. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone knew the cowboys were behind it. And in every whispered accusation, Curly Bill's name rose like smoke from a gun barrel. He had the motive, he had the means, and he had the fury. But something else had changed. Wyatt Earp was no longer a marshal bound by legal limitations. Morgan's death broke something in him. What rose from that loss wasn't just a lawman. It was a hunter born of vengeance riding beneath a black storm cloud, with Doc Holliday at his side, and a posse of men who understood that justice would no longer come from courtrooms. It would come from the barrel of a gun. The war escalated. Robberies, ambushes, and executions. The cowboys doubled down, trying to hold their ground. Curly Bill, still bearing the scar from Wallace's bullet, took part in robberies that funded the gang's operations. Most notably the Tombstone Bisbee stage heist. They hit hard. They hit fast. But now the law hit back just as viciously, and Wyatt wasn't playing by the rules anymore. Each side hunted the other through mountains, deserts, and forgotten valleys. Every canyon became a potential grave. Every campfire could draw bullets. And looming over it all was the final confrontation, an unspoken certainty that Curly Bill and Wyatt Earp were on a collision course no one could avoid. The gunfight at the OK Corral didn't kill Curly Bill, but it ensured his death had a time and place. And though he still rode with fire in his eyes and a shotgun in his hands, even Brocius must have known. The wild had shifted. The hunters had become the hunted. And this time, vengeance wore a badge. The desert knows silence like few other places on earth. But on March 24, 1882, that silence would be shattered by the roar of gunfire and the fall of one of the Old West's deadliest outlaws. It happened at a place called Iron Springs, later known as Mescal Springs, a dusty watering hole nestled in the Whetstone Mountains of southeastern Arizona. And it was there that fate caught up to Curly Bill Brocius. Wyatt Earp rode into Iron Springs with fire in his chest and blood on his hands. His posse was small: Doc Holliday, Texas Jack Vermillion, Sherman McMaster, and a few others, but they were unified by vengeance. Morgan Earp was dead, Virgil was crippled, and justice had failed them. The law had turned its back, so now Wyatt wore vengeance like a second skin. He wasn't there to arrest Curly Bill, he was there to bury him. They were expecting to meet a courier named Charlie Smith, a man bringing funds from Tombstone to finance their vendetta ride. Instead, what they found were cowboys, Curly Bill among them, camped by the stream, cooking over open flames, their rifles nearby, but not in hand. It was the briefest moment of calm before all hell broke loose. As Wyatt dismounted, someone shouted, a gun cocked, and then came the blast. The cowboys opened fire in a violent eruption. Bullets hissed through the air like angry insects. Wyatt's horse reared, struck in the haunch, and collapsed beneath him. But Earp didn't flinch. He stood up in the storm of lead, calmly raised his shotgun and scanned for the man who had haunted him since Tombstone. Curly Bill. There he was. Brocius stood across the creek, aiming a shotgun of his own. The two men locked eyes. No hesitation, no warning. Curly Bill fired, missed. Wyatt returned fire, unleashing both barrels of his shotgun at 15 paces. The blast caught Brocius in the stomach, nearly tearing him in half. The outlaw's body flew backward, crumpling into the muddy edge of the stream. Silence fell again, but only for a moment. Gunfire erupted once more as the rest of the cowboys scrambled for cover, but Wyatt kept moving, reloading in the open like a man who believed death couldn't touch him. Bullets sliced through his coat, pierced the air beside his ears, but none found their mark. They called him invincible that day, maybe he was. One by one the cowboys were hit. Johnny Barnes was shot in the chest. Milt Hicks took a bullet to the hand. Vermillion was grazed while trying to recover a dropped rifle. Doc Holliday shouted warnings, returning fire with deadly precision, while McMaster dodged bullets by inches. The camp was chaos, gunpowder and blood, but Wyatt was still standing. When the smoke cleared, Curly Bill Brocius was dead. The once-feared leader of the cowboys lay motionless in the dirt, the victim of the very violence he had lived by. The man who had laughed through gunfights, survived assassination attempts, and led an outlaw empire, had finally met the one force he couldn't outrun: Wyatt Earp, Fury. There was no trial, no last words. Just a shotgun blast and a dusty grave near Frank Patterson's ranch, close to the banks of the Babocomari River. No headstone, no official marker, just legend. And maybe that was fitting, because Curly Bill never cared for rules. He lived outside them. But even legends end. And on that spring day in 1882, the sun set on the last ride of one of the Wild West's most feared gunslingers. But the story wasn't over. Because the blood he spilled, the chaos he left behind, it all still echoed through the territory. And for Wyatt Earp, the ride wasn't done. As the dust settled over Iron Springs, and the last echoes of gunfire faded into the vast emptiness of the Arizona plains, Curly Bill Brocius, once a storm of chaos and defiance, was no more. His blood mingled with the stream, soaking the earth that had long sheltered his crimes. And yet even in death, Brocius refused to vanish quietly. His legacy, shrouded in contradiction and mystery, would only grow stronger as the decades passed. Wyatt Earp never hesitated in his retelling. In every version of the story, he looked Brocius in the eye, pulled the trigger, and watched the outlaw fall. His account was published in the Tombstone epitaph, then later immortalized in dime novels and campfire tales. But despite Wyatt's certainty, The West had a way of twisting facts into fables. And soon, whispers emerged. Was Brocius really dead? Some claimed the body at Iron Springs wasn't Curly Bill at all, that in the confusion of gunfire another man had been gunned down. Others swore they'd seen Brocius alive weeks later, riding through the mountains with his hat pulled low and a fresh scar on his jaw. These stories were dismissed as exaggeration, but not all of them. The truth is, Brocius' body was never positively identified by law. Wyatt and his posse didn't stick around long enough for a formal confirmation. They left the corpse behind, buried hurriedly by fellow cowboys near Frank Patterson's ranch, close to the Babakamari River. There was no official grave marker, no headstone carved with his name, only dust, memory, and rumor. And in the Old West, that was more than enough to spark legend. Curly Bill became more than a man. He became a ghost. His supposed grave, lost to time, was said to have once belonged to Frank Stillwell, another outlaw tangled in the blood feud between the Cowboys and the Earps. Over time, the locations blurred. Locals passed down stories of a restless spirit near Sulphur Springs Valley. Ranchers spoke of strange shadows, of a man walking at dusk with a shotgun slung across his back, vanishing before the eye could focus. They called it Brocius' curse, a reminder that vengeance doesn't end with death, especially in a land that remembers every drop of blood spilled on its soil. Historians tried to clarify the facts. Some cited George Parsons, who passed through the Muleshoe Ranch just weeks before Iron Springs, noting Brocius was still recovering from Wallace's bullet wound. Others argued there was no way Brocius could have ridden and fought so soon after his injuries. But evidence was scarce, and every gap in the record left space for myth, and what a myth it became. The tale of Curly Bill Brocius, drunken killer of lawmen, charismatic terror of Tombstone, nemesis to Wyatt Earp, lived on far beyond his time. He became a fixture in books, films, and American folklore. Played by actors who leaned into his chaos and charm, he stood toe-to-toe with other legendary figures of the Wild West. Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Doc Holliday, a villain to some, a folk hero to others, but always unforgettable. Even among outlaws, Brocius stood apart. He wasn't a cold strategist like Jesse James or a tragic youth like Billy the Kid. He was chaos incarnate. He lived for the thrill, the fight, the chase, the whiskey-fueled nights where law and logic disappeared beneath a desert moon. He didn't just break the rules, he danced on the pieces, and perhaps that's why his grave remains unmarked. The land itself couldn't decide if it should bury him or remember him forever. In the aftermath of Curly Bill Brocius's fall, Wyatt Earp didn't ride back into Tombstone as a hero. He rode deeper into the shadows of legend. The man who had once worn a badge was now something else entirely. He had become a ghost of justice, a vigilante chasing silhouettes across the desolate bones of the frontier. His mission was no longer about law, it was about vengeance and memory. The vendetta ride that followed Morgan Earp's assassination had started with a thunderclap and left bodies in its wake, Curly Bill among them. But Wyatt wasn't done. He believed others were responsible. Johnny Ringo, Ike Clanton, Pete Spence. The names echoed like rifle cracks in his head, each one tied to the night Morgan died, each one unfinished business. Yet the West was changing, slowly, inexorably. Territories were becoming states. Railroads cut across once wild trails, and the rule of law, real law, was creeping in. For men like Wyatt Earp, there was less room to operate, fewer places to vanish. He was a symbol of an era already turning to dust, a gunslinger trying to outdraw time itself. He wandered after the vendetta, to Colorado, California, Alaska. From boomtown to boomtown, he chased fortune in mining camps and card halls, telling stories of Tombstone, of gunfights and cowboys, of Curly Bill's last scream as he fell into the stream. Reporters listened. Writers took notes. And slowly, Wyatt began to shape his legacy with every tale he told. Some say he exaggerated, others say he left too much out. But one thing was certain. He never forgot Curly Bill. The shootout at Iron Springs became a pillar of his mythos. It was the moment where he stood alone, gunned down one of the most feared outlaws in the West, and walked away untouched. It was impossible, improbable, and yet everyone wanted it to be true. Because it wasn't just a story, it was a legend, and legends once born refused to die. Wyatt lived long past the blood-soaked days of Tombstone. He saw the Wild West vanish beneath automobiles and electric lights. He dined with Hollywood directors. He gave advice on Western films. In a strange twist of fate, the man who had once shot Curly Bill in the gut now advised actors on how to draw a gun like it was 1881. And through it all, he held onto the past like a sacred relic, polishing it with memory and myth until it gleamed with nostalgia. He died in 1929 at the age of 80, an old man not in a dusty saloon or a back alley, but in Los Angeles, in a city he barely recognized. His funeral was attended by people who had never heard a gunshot fired in anger, who only knew the West from books and silent films. And yet, they mourned him as one of the last true cowboys, the final gunslinger of a fading age. But in the story of Wyatt Earp, Curly Bill was always there, his name whispered between chapters, the moment at Iron Springs standing like a monument in Wyatt's saga. Because a legend needs its villain. And in Curly Bill Brocius, Wyatt had faced the very embodiment of chaos and carved his name into history with the barrel of a shotgun. Two men, one stream, one shot that cut through more than flesh. It sliced through the mythos of a nation still learning how to tell its own story. When the dust of history begins to settle, what remains isn't always fact. It's what people choose to remember. And in the case of Curly Bill Brocius, it wasn't just the outlaw who survived, it was the myth. Over the decades, the man who once drank whiskey with outlaws and exchanged bullets with legends was reborn on screen, stage, and page as one of the most unforgettable villains of the Wild West. Curly Bill didn't just die at Iron Springs, he was resurrected in Hollywood. In 1993, the film Tombstone reignited America's obsession with the Earps saga. But while the spotlight naturally fell on Kurt Russell, S. Wyatt, and Val Kilmer, S. iconic take on Doc Holliday, it was Powers Booth as Curly Bill Brocius who stole scenes with every sinister grin. Draped in arrogance, charm, and raw menace, Booth's portrayal turned Curly Bill into something more than a historical figure. He became cinematic chaos, a charismatic devil dancing in the ruins of the law. "Hell's coming with me," Wyatt says. But it was Curly Bill who welcomed the fire. Hollywood couldn't resist the duality of the man. He wasn't just a killer, he was complicated. A drunk, a joker, a man who laughed in church and gunned down sheriffs in the street. He was the embodiment of the untamed frontier, the answer to every white-hatted marshal who thought justice was clean. In film after film, he became the necessary darkness, the storm to test the lawman's resolve. But his reach went beyond the silver screen. In books, Curly Bill appears not just as a historical player, but as a symbol of everything dangerous and alluring about the Old West. Writers have painted him as a sadist, a wildman, even a misunderstood product of his violent time. Some accounts play with the theory that he wasn't really killed at Iron Springs, that he vanished into Mexico, changed his name, and lived out his days in the anonymity the desert offers so generously. Video games like Red Dead Redemption feature characters clearly inspired by Brocius, charismatic gang leaders who walk the line between leadership and lunacy, whose trigger fingers define territory more than any badge. The outlaw archetype in modern storytelling owes much to men like Curly Bill, who turned crime into theater and violence into legacy. Even music caught the echo. In outlaw country and western ballads, lyrics speak of dusty saloons, bloody shootouts, and lawless nights. Curly Bill's legend bleeds into these tales like a ghost note, uncredited but unmistakable. He was never the hero of the West, but he was its chaos, its warning, its fire. And still, the real man remains elusive. Historians dig through court records, dusty newspaper clippings, and eyewitness accounts, searching for the true Curly Bill. Was he a ruthless killer, a product of lawless times, a pawn in a larger war between cattle interests and civic order? Or was he all of it, man and myth, villain and victim? What's certain is this: wherever the Wild West is remembered, Curly Bill Brocius rides with it. In every showdown, in every outlaw gang assembled around a campfire, in every slow draw beneath a desert sun. His name is whispered with reverence and fear, proof that sometimes it's not the good men who are remembered longest, but the ones who dared to challenge the entire system, shotgun in hand and grin on their face. When Wyatt Earp pulled the trigger that fateful day at Iron Springs and watched Curly Bill Brocius fall into the water, the story should have ended there. Justice delivered, Outlaw vanquished. But the Wild West wasn't built on endings. It thrived on shadows, on doubts, on the thrill of not knowing. And as time marched on, whispers began to rise from the dust. What if Curly Bill didn't die that day? The first seeds of doubt were sown by those who knew the land better than any sheriff. Local ranchers, cowboys, old-timers who swore they'd seen Brocius weeks, even months, after Iron Springs. A bearded man with a limp, a familiar voice behind a saloon door, an outlaw riding at dusk, staying just far enough away to avoid identification. To them, Wyatt Earp's word wasn't proof. It was just another version of the story. After all, there was no official inquest, no coroners, no public burial. Brocius's body, if it was truly his, was buried quickly and quietly near Frank Patterson's ranch, without a headstone, without ceremony. It was a bandit's grave, anonymous and forgotten. That absence, the missing corpse, the silent dirt, left a void for speculation to thrive. One theory, persistent and stubborn, claimed the man Wyatt shot wasn't Curly Bill at all. That in the confusion, smoke and frenzy of the gunfight, someone else took the bullet. A decoy, a hired gun, or perhaps just another cowboy with a beard and bad luck. And if it wasn't Brocius, where had he gone? Rumors placed him in Mexico, living under an alias, married to a rancher's daughter and running cattle across the border. Others said he had joined a group of outlaws hiding in the Sierra Madre, becoming a shadowy legend among the bandidos. A few stories claimed he returned to the States under a new name, quiet, hidden, forgotten. There were even drunken whispers that Brocius had fled to South America, just like Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid would famously attempt years later. But perhaps the most haunting theory of all is this, that Wyatt Earp lied. Some historians suggest Wyatt had something to prove. After Morgan's murder, the law had failed him. He had to become justice, and when the opportunity to face Curly Bill came, whether he killed the real man or not, he needed the story to end that way. Wyatt needed the kill, needed the closure. He needed to believe it himself, because legends aren't always born from truth. Sometimes they're carved from necessity, and it wasn't just the historians. In the decades following the gunfight, outlaws who claimed to know Brocius emerged with strange details. One claimed he'd helped Brocius escape. Another swore Brocius had confessed to surviving and starting over. None of these accounts were confirmed, but they were never fully disproven either. Modern researchers have tried to verify the truth. They've searched burial records, dug into ranch ledgers, scoured Mexican archives. Some even proposed DNA testing, hoping to find familial links. But nothing definitive has ever surfaced. And perhaps that's exactly what Brocius would have wanted. Because in the Old West, death wasn't always the end. Sometimes it was the beginning of the legend. Curly Bill may have died that day, or he may have slipped through the cracks, chuckling in the dark as history wrote its final chapter without him. But either way, his name remains etched into the mythos of the West, not just because of what he did, but because of what might have been. Curly Bill Brocius didn't write laws, build towns, or sign treaties. He didn't tame the West. He set it on fire. And long after the saloons emptied, the gun smoke cleared, and the dust swallowed up the last hoofprints of the cowboys, Curly Bill's name still lingers, like a half-heard laugh in the dark, daring history to forget him. But the West doesn't forget men like him. It remembers them in legends, in nightmares, in whispered warnings about what happens when chaos rides free. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Brocius never chased political power or long-lasting fame. He didn't care about legacy in the traditional sense. He thrived in the moment, unpredictable, deadly, wild. One day he was drinking and laughing with friends. The next, he was gunning down sheriffs or watching friends die in backroom ambushes. He was the embodiment of a world without rules, and that more than anything defined his legend. While others tried to bring order, Curly Bill was disorder. He didn't play by the codes of honor that romanticized the West. He operated on impulse, pride, and a taste for danger. He killed, not because he had to, but because he could. And yet, there was a strange charisma to him. People followed him, not because he inspired respect, but because he embodied the reckless freedom that so many longed for, but feared to embrace. That's why Curly Bill endures. Because in every story about him, whether it's the killing of Fred White, the drunken outbursts in Tombstone, or his last stand at Iron Springs, he represents the side of the West we pretend not to admire, the lawless, the ungoverned, the man who answers to no one. In a world becoming more controlled, more polite, more structured, Brocius was a living rejection of civilization's grip. Even today, his name appears in books, films, reenactments, and lore. Tour guides walk visitors through dusty streets, pointing to bullet holes and spinning tales of that wild-eyed outlaw who laughed in the face of death. They may not know the whole truth, but they don't need to. The image of Curly Bill, grinning beneath a weather-worn hat, shotgun in hand, ready to turn any moment into mayhem, is enough. And yet, as with all legends, the line between man and myth fades. Was he a cold-blooded killer, or just a man caught in a brutal world? Was he drunk on violence, or simply surviving the only way he knew how? Historians debate, writers speculate, audiences imagine, but Curly Bill Brocius no longer belongs to fact. He belongs to the story, and in the end, that's where he wanted to be. So next time you hear a tale from the Old West, the kind with outlaws and lawmen, stagecoaches and six-shooters, listen closely. If the wind's just right and the fire burns low, you might catch the echo of a laugh, wild and reckless, from somewhere beyond the canyon. That's Curly Bill. Still riding, still grinning, still dangerous. Se você gostou dessa jornada pelas trilhas do Velho Oeste, deixe o seu like, compartilhe com outros amantes de história e comente aqui embaixo de qual cidade e país você está nos assistindo. E claro, se ainda não é inscrito no canal, aperte o botão e junte-se a nós para mais histórias incríveis, direto das páginas esquecidas do passado. Até a próxima, parceiro!